ready to go. All right, let us gather back together.
Thank you.
I was going to go through and point out all the correlations between the Old Testament covenants and the covenants in the prayer book, but I don't need to. I think you covered it very well. So, absolutely. But I think that is an interesting exercise and a worthy way of digging into the history of covenants and also the prayer book. So if we look at the covenants, we've been looking at more or less generically, but we can start to look at the covenants made between God and his people. The first really one is the Noahic covenant, the covenant between Noah and God. And it's really more than just a covenant between Noah and God. It's a covenant really that God is making with creation, as you can see this in Genesis 6:18 and following. And also a covenant between God and people in general. And there again, there's the rainbow as the sign that God gives that as a sign that he will maintain the order of creation and the waters of chaos will not return to engulf the world. He'll continue to hold back the chaos. Then the Abrahamic covenant, of course, we've talked about a good deal, and I really made the point last time that there were at least two parts to that Abrahamic covenant, and one was that Abraham would be a great nation, and then the other part of it would be that there would be a great land that they would inhabit, so land and progeny. But I believe was it Collins or Rutledge made the really excellent point that there was 4 parts to the Abrahamic covenant. And those are the first 2, progeny and land. But then the third is maybe even more important. I will be your God. I will be your God. According to Genesis 17:8, God has chosen that man and his progeny. And God will belong to him. He will belong to God in a way that other nations do not. That's a central feature of the covenant. And but wait, there's more. The fourth part of that Abrahamic covenant is also really fascinating, which I hadn't thought about. All peoples of the earth shall be blessed through you. It's a wonderful covenant then. I mean, it's to one fellow, but it has consequences for a people, and it has consequences for all people. And it's interesting to hold that thought in mind and see how that is worked out in the history of Israel. And we'll talk a bit about that. But so, father of a great nation, that the nation descended from Abraham will have the land of Canaan, that Yahweh will be their God, or God will be God to them, and all the peoples of the earth shall be blessed through them. Now, again, as there was a sign in the Noahic covenant, the rainbow, there's circumcision in the Abrahamic covenant, and I don't have any particular additions to make to Collins or Rutledge, but they say that Abraham and his male descendants must be circumcised. That was the stipulation, that the circumcision was a sign of belonging to God. By it, God had set his seal upon his covenant people, and he has called them to be his own. And circumcision was a mark of obedience. By the doing of it was the mark of obedience to God that living in covenant relationship required. From infancy, God's people bore this sign that marked them out as belonging to God in a special way. The outward sign was the mark of an inward consecration. Any other thoughts about the Abrahamic covenant? I don't know that all covenants have signs, but those certainly do. Those two do. Of course, and then the Sinaitic covenant. Thank you. Get those dentures in, and of course that is called the Sinaitic covenant because it was made on Sinai, and it's between Moses and Moses' people and the people, the promise to the people of Abraham and God. So, if you remember those four parts to the Abrahamic covenant, I believe, was it Rutledge who talked about how those four were fulfilled, those four functions were fulfilled in the Sinaitic covenant. A great nation, yes, that marked, the definition, the birth of this nation when this covenant was made. And it represents, in part, that Abraham would be the father of this great nation. It was the continuation. It was the fulfillment of that promise. The land, they had not yet received that yet as their inheritance at the time of the making of the covenant, but the possession of the promised land featured prominently in the events surrounding the Exodus, of course. And 2, I will be their God. 3, I will be their God. We find a similar statement, I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God, according to Exodus 7. The formulation from Deuteronomy is very interesting. It's something we're thinking about. I think it's good Old Testament theology that plays through much of the Old Testament, and that could be because of the authorship, but according to Deuteronomy, the Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous than other people, for you were fewest of all peoples. But it was because the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to your forefathers that he brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery, from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. How often is that played out in the history of Egypt, of Israel? We think about David, for example, being the youngest of the smallest tribe, and so forth. God takes the initiative. People are responded to this act of gracious election through loving obedience. We will do everything the Lord has said, they say in Exodus 19. So, great nation, it's coming into being by the words of the covenant. The land, that's on the horizon. By the covenant, God will be their God. And finally, the universal blessing, that they will be a blessing to all people. Rutledge makes the point that Israel is called to be a nation of priests, mediators between men and God, revealing God to the nations and bringing the nations to God. Okay? So, some of the aspects, I think, of priesthood. Consecration. They're consecrated, set apart, ritually brought into holiness. They're granted special access. Priests are, right? They could go to the Holy of Holies. Moses, though not a priest, had special access to God. The priests make sacrifices. They present the prayers and petitions to God of the people. They bring God's word to the people. Sounds pretty familiar, right? And they interpret the law. These are all aspects, characteristics of priestly office. Is it played out in the life of Israel? God seems to be setting them apart right now through the law. By definition, they're to be a different people because of the law. They have special access to God that other nations don't. Witness the theophany on the mountain. They make sacrifices. They sure do. Part of the law is appointing those sacrifices and how they're to be made. They present the prayers of the people to God. Certainly they can do that. I don't know that they do that for the world, but perhaps they do. They have the word that God has given them, and they can share that and do share that. Witness the court of the Gentiles in the temple, and they do serve as the interpreter through the rabbinic tradition, certainly, of God's word. I wonder how many of these things we could claim as Christians. Interesting thought. Baptism, communion, prayers of the people, Sunday morning liturgy of the word. Yeah, interesting. They are to be a holy and distinctive people. That is, the Israelites. Holy and distinctive, a people set apart through the law, through the covenant. Set apart in whom God's presence could be seen. A light to the nations, right? To whom the nations would be drawn, seeking to share Israel's relationship to God. Okay. There was a brief note in Rutledge, she talking about works and grace, which probably didn't need to be spelled out, but I think it's worthy of note that it says that God executes a unilateral act of grace by initiating the covenant and puts an obligation on those who would inherit the blessings of the covenant. The obligation is to live in accordance with its requirements. And those two things are inseparable. God enters into a relationship with Abraham and his descendants while the people can do nothing to merit inclusion within God's covenant. Having been included, they are obliged to seek to live as members of it. And it will affect every part of their life. Some of the early covenants with Noah and the first covenants with Abraham are God promising to do things. And then there's the obligations start happening. And that's where we get into the law, of course. But, I don't think you have to worry about attaining God's love and grace through the works of the law. That's already there. But these are ways of living and maintaining that relationship, right? Okay. So, question for you. Let's switch over to talk about the law a little bit. Again, a fascinating subject that certainly we can barely scratch the surface on, but I think it's just so very important for us as Christians, as people of the new covenant, of Jesus' law, if you will, to know about the law of the Old Testament. So here's a question for you. How is the law portrayed in the New Testament?
There are contrasts.
Yeah.
Like Jesus is the fulfillment of the law.
Right.
But then we also see the examples of the Pharisees who were criticized for being so literal about the law that they, according to the New Testament perspective, lost the flavor and the essence of the law.
Yes. The intent.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, good. What else? There's one author in the New Testament that talks a lot about law and grace. That would be Paul. And does anyone know anything about Paul's works? What he says about the law? You haven't had the New Testament class yet? Well, it's interesting because he is certainly coming from this mountain of experience as a Jew, talking to sometimes Jewish converts and sometimes talking to Gentile converts. So he typically makes, a contrast between the monolithic law and the monolithic belief in God and God's grace. He is always the first to say that the law kills and belief in Jesus Christ gives faith and gives life. He feels that we as humans can never fulfill the law. Only one person can and ever has done that, and that's Jesus Christ. So you can't, I don't believe, have a complete understanding of the New Testament if you just leave it at that. It's enough, I suppose, to have faith in Christ alone. But to understand the New Testament, I think you have to realize that he, as I said, is coming from this experience of the law as a Pharisee himself, who has this experience of the law and what it could do and what it couldn't do. And yet, as you say, Jesus said he came to fulfill the law. You don't get a sense from Jesus that he wants to abolish the law or set it aside. But, it's the new covenant. It's the new relationship. It's the new law, which may be just a positive spin on the old law. I don't think Jesus says anything that would countermand the commandments. But it's a matter of the way of looking at it or the way of emphasizing. So keep those things in mind as we go through this, because really from an Old Testament perspective, the law was just so positive. It was so wonderful. Read Psalm 119, right? Your law is a light into my path and a lamp unto my feet, or whatever it is. But and so many times in the Psalms, I meditate on your law day and night, and it gives me joy. It's something that brings and allows the individual and the community to have this relationship, to be in right relationship with God. Again, thinking about how it was talked about in Isaiah and Jeremiah and Hosea and Malachi and Proverbs, that relationship is a loving relationship. And it's a way of maintaining that loving relationship. It's a way for people to respond to God. It would just be one-sided if God just showered us with all these blessings and we didn't really do anything, or we would feel, I think, unfulfilled without a way, an avenue of responding to God, whether that be thanksgiving or doing what He says. And the law is about doing what He says. So it's a way to respond to God, to accord the honor, the obedience, and love to God that God, the freer of the people, is obliged to have. A way to fulfill their covenantal relationships and their obligations. A way to have fellowship with Him. So it's an avenue of relationship. And how could that be a bad thing? To be in relationship to the God of creation and ongoing providential care. The law shaped and defined the character of the people as well. You knew who you were. If you did the law, you were a part of God's people. And you were different than other cultures in some ways. It made them a unique people, gave guidance and instruction in godly living, and served as a means to have that distinctive character. And because of that distinctive character, it was thought that people would see them and come to them because of their distinctiveness, because of this relationship they have with the Almighty. Certainly, and this really shouldn't be lost on us. I don't say this lightly. We show who we are by what we do. Yes? I mean, don't you hate it when people talk about love and yet you can't see it? The more I live into my Christian baptismal vows, the more I think about how love is an action. It's not an emotion. It's an emotion, has an emotional component, but it is this relational action. It's out there in the world. It's not just, nice, that kind of thing. So yes, doing this law, that's how you can love. It sounds sort of counterintuitive, but identity and action are coextensive here. It is a way set apart to be holy. And again, though it seems to be, from the New Testament perspective in some ways, to be onerous, burdensome, what the Pharisees chose to do to the weakest of the people, which was onerous. The law shouldn't be, or is not, onerous. It should be freeing. It's, again, that weird thing that I don't believe we can ever be free, but we can be free within the bounds of a relationship or a covenant or what have you. So it was a way of being free. Okay. And the other thing, I guess, is to say that it reveals not only who the Old Testament people were, but also reveals who God is, what He finds to be valuable, what God finds to be important, and so there are as was pointed out in our readings, two kinds of law. The Decalogue is apodictic, that is absolute commands or prohibitions, thou shalt not, with no conditional qualifications. You have to look in the book of the covenant, Exodus 21 through 23, to get more of those, and that's more casuistic or casuistry. If X, then Y. If you do this, then this happens. If you do that, then this happens. And one of our authors made the point that the great law codes of Hammurabi, they were largely casuistic, if X, then Y. So let's take a look at the Decalogue. Collins had a bit on the Decalogue. I think it's important to just have a sense of what they are, their meaning, their importance. It is a part of the observance of Lent. It's possible, if you start the penitential order, you can start it with the reading of the Decalogue. We didn't do that. Did you? Did you? In the Great Litany. Okay. Yep. But there is also in, that penitential order, the reading of the Decalogue. You could do that every week if you wanted to in Lent, or at another penitential occasion. It's there in our prayer book. It's there, a part of our tradition. It's nothing that is emphasized, again, but it's something that is there. And I think we have to be careful, because it has so much baggage these days, doesn't it? How many wranglings about courthouse lawns have we heard, whether to put the Ten Commandments in the front of the courthouse or not, et cetera, et cetera. It has so much baggage for so many people, but let's look a little bit at the Decalogue and see if we can make sense of them ourselves and see what some of the issues are surrounding them. Some of them are fairly straightforward, others not so much. I was reading a commentary. I think it's a fairly good commentary. If you're interested in a good commentary of the Exodus it's a commentary by Brevard Childs, well-known name in Old Testament. I think probably New Testament study as well. Brevard Childs, well-known, actually has a textbook on the Old Testament as well. He makes these points about the Ten Commandments. He says, the commandments are given by God as an expression of his will for his covenant people. Yeah. They're not to be seen as simply moral directives apart from the living authority of God himself, who has made himself known. So, it's a part of who God is, a part of his relationship with his people. And along those lines, the commandments are given by God to his people in the context of a covenant. Whatever broader implications the commandments may have, their primary function is directed toward the shaping of the life of a chosen community. Again, that distinctive quality and character. The intent of the commandments is to engender love of God and love of neighbor. That's the positive spin on things. That's where Jesus would go, right? What's the summary of the law? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. And Brevard Childs would say, yeah, even from an Old Testament perspective, that's really what's going on here, to engender the love of God and love of neighbor. Again, God has made himself known to his people as a loving deliverer, continual guide and sustainer. He has entered into a relationship with them in the Decalogue and in the Book of the Covenant. God reveals the other side of his nature, which lays claim to Israel. This is what he demands. It spells out what God requires from his covenant people whom he delivered without demanding a prior commitment. Sure. So, looking at these commandments, Collins mentions that the first 4 commandments deal with Israel's obligations to Yahweh, and the remaining 6 commandments concern relations in human society. So the first commandment, so if you want to look in your Bibles, it's Exodus 20. And that might be helpful, actually, to open that up. The 10 Commandments. The 10 words. That's what Decalogue means, of course. Could someone read verse 2?
I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery.
Mm-hmm. And the next verse?
You shall have no other gods before me.
Okay. Pretty straightforward. Interesting, is it not? And I think Collins points this out, that this isn't monotheism at this point. You shall have no other gods before you. I do have a sense that the authors of this were thinking about the fact that other countries had other gods, regional gods, gods tied to areas and states and peoples and so forth. And you're not to have any of those. God is number one. Collins makes the point that through the Exodus even we can see that the people are always sort of in just about ready to start worshiping Baal all the time, which is Canaanite. And there's also evidence of Asherah, which is also Canaanite, that he was worshipped in connection with Yahweh. Asherah was a goddess, and he notes that almost more than 2,000 figurines of this nude female figure, fertility goddess or fertility goddesses, have been found in the archaeology of Israel. So, this may be a case of, the winners write the history kind of thing. But back in the day, there might have been others. But this first commandment forbids the worship of any of those others. So, how about number 2? So that's verses 4 through 6. Could someone read that?
You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents, to the 3rd and the 4th generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation, those who love me and keep my commandments.
So, apparently a question that emerges in this and also in the corresponding 2nd commandment in Deuteronomy is whether they're talking about specifically images of Yahweh, or are they speaking of images of other gods, or are they speaking of both? From Deuteronomy, we have a sense that the author is arguing that it's about the image of Yahweh. He did not reveal himself in a form, but only in a voice. Israel should be aware of of making a graven image. They should not do that. That's prohibited because that's an incorrect response to God's manner of making himself known, which would be, which was by word. So any image is a rival human witness, which is false. But it seems to be that the scope of Exodus is larger too as well. It's to relate to other gods, other creatures, and that sort of thing. Third is the prohibiting of the wrongful use of Yahweh's name. Refers to false, frivolous oaths. Pretty straightforward. What about the fourth commandment? Let's see. 8. I think this is fairly interesting. 8 through 11. Can someone read that? Exodus 20. 8 through 11.
Remember to keep holy the Sabbath day. 6 days you may labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. No work may be done then, either by you or your son or daughter, or your male or female slave, or your beast, or by the alien who is with you.
Keep going.
In 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in it, and in them. But on the seventh day he rested. That is why the Lord has blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy.
Okay. It seems fairly straightforward. It's interesting that the prohibition against working for 7 days extends to slaves, family, livestock, even the resident alien in your town. You can't make someone else do your work for you. And again, I forget if it was someone here, someone that in our readings, or whether I read it somewhere else, but they mentioned the fact that it seems to be part of the very fabric of the universe. That's the way God created things, right? I mean, literally, that's the way God created things. The Lord, as it says, for 6 days, in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, but rested on the seventh day. As opposed to the passage in Deuteronomy, it gives a little different emphasis and talks, I think, very interesting about the fact that you're supposed to set it apart and keep this day holy because God created, that's the way God created things. But also to remember to use that day as a day to remember how you were enslaved and freed by God. So it had that purpose of remembering and keeping before you and reaffirming all those wonderful covenantal things.
We've lost that one.
Yeah, we have. And I don't know how to feel about that, really. Whether we should sell liquor on Sundays or... I don't know.
Have kids
They don't
basketball
in
games.
Pennsylvania, so.
Yeah.
Stores used to be closed on Sundays. Yeah, I remember that. It's not that long ago.
No sports for kids, no...
Really? Oh my gosh.
schedules, and now it's the day they choose, because it's like everybody is around.
Yeah. Fifth, honor father and mother. This was a staple of any code, it seemed, of the ancient Near East in the wisdom literature thereof. Childs talks about the fact that protection for parents, this was protection for the parents really, from being driven out, especially as they were getting older or being abused, and they could, abused because they could no longer work, basically. So it was a protection. Honor them. And honor had that sense of, the word honor has that sense of highly prizing, showing respect, glorifying and exalting, loving, revering. All those things are in that universe of that word, the galaxy of that word, honor. Sixth, here's a fun one. You shall not murder, mine says. Do you have anything different? Murder? Kill. Yours says kill. Yep. Apparently that's a distinctive word in Hebrew, which could mean either of those. It does seem to be the fact that it's not a blanket prohibition, right? Because if you break the law, you can be killed, stoned or what have you.
I've struggled with this in Sunday school for the kids
Yep.
because we've talked about there's a fight and then we kill them all for God. I mean, those aren't the words, but really they're putting their own spin on it, and that's what they say, and I'm like, kind of. I mean, I don't know how to make that. God is saying, I will help you be victorious over these people, which means essentially we'll beat you, we'll kill you. And I don't know.
It's hard to talk to kids about that.
Yeah.
The only thing that I've learned about this from our readings and from my further reading in Brevard Childs is the sense that the idea there is not to take things into your own hands, but things have to be okayed, if you will, by the society. So if the society or the leader of the society declares war on this group of people, then that's the way it is. And in this passage, this verse, the verb kill, has a long history, but it came to designate those acts of violence against a person which arose from personal feelings of hatred and malice. The command in its present forbids such an act of violence and rejects the right of a person to take the law into their own hands out of a feeling of personal injury. So there's the societal norms.
Okay, but you can't yourself
Right,
decide.
right. It's definitely, again, in the bounds of that covenant people, that the covenant people make those decisions through their leaders or what have you. But no, you can't just go out and say, oh, I don't like you, you hurt me, so I'm going to kill you. That's the kind of feeling. If it's okay with you, I'd rather not go into just war theory right now. Aw, I know, so much fun. Yeah, huge, just huge. But again, so it's important to know, I guess, the Ten Commandments and to sort of see what their scope is anyways, right? Whether you agree with it or not, but you know the scope, how they were limiting the conversation. Seventh, thou shalt not commit adultery. This concerns violations of the marriage, not concerned with other forms of fornication. Right, so it's specifically about a violation of the marriage covenant. 8, stealing, a broad sense of stealing. 9th, bearing false witness. The importance of truth in witnessing is illustrated by those cases where someone is put to death on the basis of a false witness. This was extremely abhorrent and should be still today. This wasn't a general prohibition against lying, but a kind of lying that would, like in a court, directly affect one's fellow citizen, fellow covenanter. And 10th, forbids the coveting of another's goods. And this does get to the internal feelings. This is how you think about another person and how you think about their goods. You shall not think of them, with that kind of desire. Which, of course, we break every day.
That's another one that gives us trouble.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
I love to imagine the first time. I'm imagining that this developed over time.
Yeah.
But the first time people would have really started hearing this, I'm picturing people just like looking at each other, slant eyes, like don't commit adultery, and you look over and you're like,
I have my wife back, I borrowed her to you.
I think it's funny. I think it's funny to speculate on how we feel when we hear these, because it's really easy to say, oh, I'll totally obey these, unless you happen to covet, unless you happen to commit adultery, unless you've stolen something, then it's a lot harder to say, yeah, I can really get behind that, because you're like, oh, maybe I want to do that.
So, Jesus came to fulfill the law. Didn't come to abolish it. Maybe the punishments aren't quite as stiff as they were back in the day, but still good ideas.
I don't know, because you could murder people with your thoughts according to Jesus.
That's true. Yep. You've heard it said, but I say to you. Yeah. Which is, of course, coming from Matthew, which is, of course, the Beatitudes, which, of course, is Jesus up on a hill, which, of course, is the Moses figure giving the new law. All right. So the Book of the Covenant, that's the rest of the law given on Sinai. That's 21 through 23. I think it was Collins who said that it stands firmly in the mainstream of other ancient Near East law systems. Nothing particularly new or different about them. They're mostly casuistic, and they qualify the absolute characters of the character of the Decalogue. For example, it talks about cases where killing is permissible and even commanded. Yeah, it talks about slavery as well. Slavery is taken for granted. Could be usually a debtor, someone who couldn't pay their debts and had to be thrown, or had to work it off, if you will, or someone who was a prisoner, captured from another tribe or what have you. The Hebrew slave terms was 6 years maximum, but there were no limits to slavery for foreign slaves. Of course, you find in Exodus 21, verses 23 and 24, the eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. (21, 23, and 24). If any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Again, I think it was Dale who made the point last time about the idea that, well, the idea here isn't to, gouge out everybody's eyes, but to say, well, if someone took your eye out, then you can't go and kill him. But there's justice involved if you take his or her eye out as a punishment for yours. All right, so could someone look up 21:15? Someone look 21:17. Someone look up 21:29.
Exodus 21:15.
Yep. 15, Exodus 21, verse 15. Someone else look 21:17. Someone else look up 21:29. Go ahead.
15.
Yep.
Anyone who attacks his father
All right. 17.
Whoever curses father or mother will be put to death.
Curses father or mother. What about 29?
But if an ox was previously in the habit of goring people, and its owner, though warned, would not keep it in, should it then kill a man or a woman? Not only must the ox be stoned, but its owner also must be put to death.
Yep. All right, so how about chapter 22, verses 18, verse 18, 22:18.
Do not allow a sorceress to live.
Okay. No sorceresses. Sorry. What about in that same chapter, verses 21 through 24?
You shall not wrong any widow or orphan. If ever you wrong them and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry. My wrath will flare up, and I will kill you with the sword, and your own wives and will be widows, and your children orphans.
There's another death penalty. Right. So there is the death penalty in this society. These are just a few things that we can find in the Book of the Covenant. And then in Exodus 23, in that chapter, starting with verse 14, we get ways that the people are supposed to give back to God and give thanks to God. And so just read a bit of 23, 14 and following.
Three times a year you are to celebrate a festival to me. Celebrate the feast of unleavened bread. For 7 days eat bread made without yeast, as I commanded you. Do this at the appointed time in the month of Abib, for in that month you came out of Egypt. No one is to appear before me empty-handed. Celebrate the feast of harvest with the first fruits of the crops you sow in your fields. Celebrate the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather in your crops from the fields. 3 times a year all the men are to appear before the sovereign Lord. Do not offer the blood of the sacrifice to me along with anything containing yeast. The fat of my festival offerings must not be kept until morning.
Okay, that's good. Get a flavor of the feasts and festivals that God tells people, that spells out for people to do. There are 3 of them: unleavened bread, the harvest festival, and the Feast of Tabernacles. So here's a really important question that each one of you, and especially you who are going on to ordination, hopefully, with God's help. How are we to view the law today in light of Jesus Christ? Just a small question.
Jesus doesn't really make sense without the law, because if it was just the law, or if you didn't have the law and you just had Jesus, you really wouldn't have the context to understand the significance of him.
Okay, so it's basic ground, the ground of what he is about. If you see him as a liberator, then it's possible you could see the law as constraining.
Or
What else?
you see Jesus as liberating, like the law was liberating, because they were liberated from Egypt,
Yep.
and that's when they were given the law. So that was liberation. Jesus is liberation.
Look at the Exultet of the in the Easter Vigil. It's all about the Exodus and freeing the slave, and yeah. What else? How are we to view the law today? We're not Jewish. Are we to try and live it? Are we trying to teach it? Are we trying to see ways that it's different from what we think today? It's a huge question, I know, but it's something you have to answer. You really do.
Well, I don't know if this answers it, but...
No, go ahead. Yeah, just blurt it out.
I mean, the law was the law then.
Yep.
And then Jesus came into the world, and the law was still, he helped us to understand it a little better, but it was still the law. And now today, I don't think we get to just say, this doesn't really work. We have to maybe, again, I don't know if we translate it again, but we have to go back to what Jesus said. It's like, this is the law. We don't get to say...
This is kind of foundational bedrock, as she was saying.
Yes, I don't know how to say it, but it's like, it's still the law.
It's still the law, but then I think of how many fights there are in the church and society, because some people are looking at Old Testament, some people are looking at New Testament. It's not like we go around, it wouldn't be appropriate or legal to go around stoning people for committing adultery. So does Jesus saying, love the Lord your God, and love your neighbor as yourself, does that then become our new law, or our new, do we orientate? I think we orientate ourselves to that, and then through that filter, we can evaluate the rest of the law. You should honor your parents because that's a loving thing. You shouldn't murder people because
It goes back to the love command.
it goes back to the love. Where the law might say it's appropriate for me to stone somebody who's committed adultery, well, lovingly, I would say no, and another person might say, well, sure, that's loving because I'm showing them the consequences of their actions. So I think you need to be really careful with, even with what looks crystal clear in the New Testament, because you can use your definition of love to justify anything. You can be, you can start picking up, soldiers' funerals and telling them they're sinners, or someone who's gay telling them that they're sinners. That's one person's definition of love, and I think we need to be really careful with that.
So
It's
how
not
do we,
fair.
how do we, so it is so easy just to think, this is Jesus' love. But you're right. If you take everybody else's interpretations and everybody's going to have something different, how do we go back? How do we?
Do you guys want to say anything about it? Have any thoughts?
I think they were eloquent.
Kind of late in the day to be too creative.
Confusing.
But hear this, and this is Brevard Childs again, and I think he sums it up so well here. The church strives to be obedient to the will of God through the gift of the Spirit of Christ, which continues to open up new and fresh avenues of freedom.
The church strives to be obedient through the gift of the Spirit.
Strives to be obedient to the will of God through the gift of the Spirit of Christ, which continues to open up new and fresh avenues of freedom. The Spirit of Christ continues to open up new and fresh avenues of freedom.
So
This,
that God will show us the new ways of interpreting the law.
yeah, this transformation of the law through Jesus Christ guards against both a deadening legalism and an uncharted enthusiasm in which the life of the church in and for the world is endangered.
What's this book that
It's Exodus. It's the commentary on Exodus. It's a series. I can't remember the series that it's a part of, but it's Brevard Childs' Exodus.
Guards against the what and
All right.
enthusiasm?
I'll read that second part again. This transformation of the law through Jesus Christ. Jesus transforms the law. This transformation of the law through Jesus guards against both a deadening legalism and an uncharted enthusiasm in which the life of the church in and for the world is endangered. So there's a lot there. But I think it's important to see that he says that there is law, there is God's will, there is God's Spirit, there's Jesus Christ's transformation of the law. And the Spirit continues to open up new ways of freedom. Again, there's that Exodus, freedom image there, which is so, so important. So, just to follow up, and maybe this is where you're going, but again, we as Episcopalians also have this criteria of history, tradition, and reason, those wonderful things that can help us find that new freedom, right? Within the bonds of tradition and history and Bible and tradition, Scripture, and reason. I'm sorry, Dale, what were you going to say?
Oh, I was going to ask you a question because you were talking about for childs and
yes.
Are you familiar with the Collins book that is like this one we're using as the short introduction? And are you familiar with the bigger one?
No.
Oh, I was just looking to find some idea of whether or not I wanted to spend that much money.
Is there? Collins says.
The big one is the little one was not, but the big one is.
Does the library fair have it, or could they get it?
The library has no money.
Oh, okay.
It's a donation.
We probably don't have it. Most of the things we have in there are elderly.
Yeah.
So,
I represent that.
this is a bit touchy, but I think this is the way the church continues to work. That is to say, and again, you brought it up, issue of gay rights and gay marriage and all that kind of stuff. It is, I guess, Old Testament law. Yes?
Yes.
You're not going to get around it. It's even a part of the things that Paul says you shouldn't do. I mean, you can't get around it. It's just there. We do believe that there's the Holy Spirit who continues to open up understandings, turn our hearts, find new emphases, seeing with wider perspective. That's how the church can make those changes. Because that's a doctrinal change. That's a huge change in the church. And for some people and a lot of Christendom, you can't do that. But we say, well, the Spirit of God is still active and working and showing and enlightening. And so we can even think about these sorts of things. It's one of the reasons I'm an Episcopal. And I think it's such a tough issue. It's so hard. It bothers me. It really does. But I'm just saying those are the kind of moves the church has made and why I think they can do that. The church can do that. Does it make sense? I'm not saying you have to agree with it, but it makes sense, right?
Justify what you want rather
Well,
than
it's
what
true.
is in.
It's true. Look at it that way.
I think there's a fine line between discerning what's God's will and what's your own.
Absolutely.
Even the church can.
Absolutely. Incredibly difficult.
Well, and we have another religion, secular unionism, which is morphed into really weird political correctness.
Yeah.
Because anything goes.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying.
It's tough, though.
So anyways, that's the fun stuff for today.
Back up the rabbit hole.
Yeah. I really think it's almost too late to go into the Exodus part of what we were going to do, but we were reading chapters 5 through 10, and really those are the I guess we can start in. We have like 15 minutes. Might as well. I want you to get your money's worth here. So, looking at Exodus chapter 5. So, in chapter 5, Moses makes his first demand to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh doesn't like what Moses has to say, and he punishes the Israelites for what Moses has said. 6 is a bit of a reiteration, but 7 and following. Could someone read 7:14 and 14 through 19? Nikki? Yeah.
Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh is obdurate in refusing to let the people go. Tomorrow morning, when he sets out for the water, go and present yourself by the riverbank, holding in your hand the staff that turned into a serpent. Say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you with the message. Let my people go to worship me in the desert. But as yet you have not listened. The Lord now says, this is how you shall know that I am the Lord. I will strike the water of the river with the staff I hold, and it shall be changed into blood. The fish in the river shall die, and the river itself shall become so polluted that the Egyptians will be unable to drink its water.
Right. So, fun stuff happening here. This is the first plague, and it isn't cool because it really makes it takes off the water source for the Egyptians, and the fish die, and then if you read farther on, it's interesting because the magicians of Egypt did the same by their secret arts. So Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he would not listen to them. And he went away. And all the Egyptians had to dig along the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink the water of the river. So that was the first plague. Second is frogs. Wait a minute. Yes, frogs and gnats. 16, let's see. Yes. 1 through 15. Then the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, thus says, Lord, let my people go so that they may go worship me. Again, that was one of the points I wanted to make, is that the idea here was to go and be separate, to go worship. It might have been nothing the Egyptians wanted to see or were interested in, maybe even sacrilegious to them, but they were to go and be separate again. This is before the covenant, of course, but there's still this idea of worshiping separately, a unique people, so forth. If you refuse to let them go, a plague will come with frogs. The river shall swarm with frogs. They shall come up into your palace and your bedchamber and into your house of your officials. So that would be really disgusting, but you could live through it, I suppose. I think there's a general escalation of these plagues. So then comes the, in 16 through 19, the gnats. Stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the earth so that it may become gnats. Other translations read mosquitoes or flying insects. And they did so. Aaron stretched out his hand and struck the earth, and gnats came on humans and animals alike. All the dust of the earth turned into gnats throughout the whole land of Egypt. The magicians tried to produce gnats by their secret arts, but they couldn't. Okay, so now Yahweh's starting to outclass the magicians of Egypt.
I think if you had magicians that were that skilled, you could ask them to turn the spells back. Clean up the water.
Yeah,
Get rid of
yeah.
the frogs.
That's right.
Not make your own. It just doesn't make any sense.
Excellent point. Excellent point. And the magician said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And the fourth plague, we have flies. Which would have been really very disgusting. And the livestock become then diseased in 9:1 through 7. Can someone read that one for us? 9:1 through 7.
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and say to him, 'This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go and continue to hold them back, the hand of the Lord will bring a terrible plague on your livestock in the field, on your horses and donkeys and camels, and on your cattle and sheep and goats. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and that of Egypt, so that no animal belonging to the Israelites will die.' The Lord set a time and said, 'Tomorrow the Lord will do this in the land.' And the next day the Lord did it. All the livestock of the Egyptians died, but not one animal belonging to the Israelites died. Pharaoh sent men to investigate and found that not even one of the animals of the Israelites had died. Yet his heart was unyielding, and he would not let the people go."
Right.
Oh, and 8 and 9 too?
Sure.
Okay. Then for the plague of boils, then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Take a handful of soot from a furnace and have Moses toss it into the air in the presence of Pharaoh. It will become a fine dust over the whole land of Egypt, and festering boils will break out on men and animals throughout the land."
Okay. Things are becoming personal here. Sorry, we have to rush through these, but seventh is hail. Of course, this would have been really hard on the grains, the lands. Flax was much esteemed by the Egyptians. Egypt was the great linen market of the ancient world. Barley was used for making coarse bread. Wheat was the most cultivated of the grains and was a terrible loss for the lives of and livelihood of the Egyptians, as Egypt was the great bread basket for the world. So now it's becoming really economically very difficult for the people. And that gets worse in the next one, which is locusts. Interestingly, there's an account by Lord Bryce, whoever that was, who spent a lot of time in Egypt. He described a swarm of locusts. It says, it's a strange sight, beautiful if you can forget the destruction it brings with it. The whole air, to 12, even 18 feet above the ground, is filled with insects, reddish brown in body with bright, gauzy wings. When the sun's rays catch them, it's like the seas sparkling with light. When you see them against a cloud, they are like the dense flakes of a driving snowstorm. You feel as if you had never before realized the immensity in number. The blot of the sun above, the cover of the ground beneath, and fill the air whichever way one looks. The breeze carries them swiftly past, but they come on in fresh clouds, a host of which there is no end, each of them harmless creature which you can catch and crush in your hand, but appalling in their power of collective devastation. Darkness is the next plague, and if you think about it, if Ra is the sun god, eclipse of the sun god here. And we will talk about the 10th and final plague. We'll go into some depth into that because that is such a pivot point for the Old Testament and also, I think, our faith as well. Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the feast. Well, it's been interesting, as always.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Let's look for a minute at what we're supposed to do for next time. So we just have 2 more months in this session. So April 14th and May 12th, correct? And next month we'll be looking at priestly theology with sacrifice and that sort of fun stuff, which is a great balance, of course, to the law. Which will be really fascinating as well. And you are to read 11 through 13 chapters, well, let's say 10 through 13, if I can amend that, 10 through 13 of the Exodus, and skim through Deuteronomy if you can. And Collins chapters 7 and 8. Collins is fairly short in the chapters, which is kind of nice, but it's somewhat dense. So we'll be looking at priestly theology of Exodus 25, Leviticus, and Numbers. 4 laws and holiness codes, and Deuteronomy. And with Rutledge, chapter 5. God and his people worship and sacrifice. So that should go well together. How are you finding these readings? Okay?
Yeah.
I think they're a pretty good complement to one another. Good enough. Well, thank you. I hope it's warmed up a little bit. I bet it has outside. It was like 10 degrees when I got up this morning. Is that a joke? Oh, calendar-wise.